The cold morning wind swept through the wide avenues of Manhattan when Theo Mercer, a boy of just 10 years old, stepped out of a taxi in front of the mirrored building of Mercer Industries, one of the largest technology and infrastructure corporations in the United States. The boy held a small black briefcase so tightly that his fingers were white. He seemed out of place there. Simple clothes, worn sneakers, school backpack, a stark contrast to the revolving doors through which impeccably dressed executives paraded. Theo took a deep breath. This was no ordinary visit. He hadn't been invited. He had no apparent connection to this place, but he had a goal. Meanwhile, on the 42nd floor, the man who commanded that entire empire watched the city from behind a glass wall. Richard Caldwell, 63, interim CEO of Mercer Industries, held a cup of coffee while reviewing reports showing recent stock declines. Since the sudden death of Edward Mercer, founder and majority owner, the company had been mired in speculation, internal disputes, and fear. Richard thought he was in control. I thought so. He believed himself to be the natural successor. After all, he had worked alongside Edward for decades and knew every aspect of the company. But the founder's will had not yet been officially released. Only the deceased's personal lawyer knew its contents, and the document was under absolute secrecy. The elevator on the ground floor opened slowly, and Theo entered, ignored by everyone. He pressed the button for the 42nd floor as if crossing a dangerous border. His heart pounded, but his expression remained rigid. He had rehearsed that moment for months. When the doors opened, the corporate environment enveloped him with impeccable carpets, minimalist desks, and the disciplined silence of professionals who hadn't expected to see a child there. Even so, Theo walked up to the receptionist, a woman with a meticulously trained expression that balanced friendliness with firmness. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking him up and down. "I need to speak with Mr. Richard Caldwell," Theo replied, his voice firm despite his age. The receptionist frowned. Children didn't have meetings with the CEO, nor did adults who weren't on the schedule. "Do you have an appointment?" Theo opened the folder. He took out an envelope with the seal of the notary's office where Edward Mercer's will was registered. The woman's eyes widened. This was official, important. "He'll want to talk to me," said the boy, returning the envelope to the folder. The receptionist hesitated, then called the main room. Inside, Richard Caldwell interrupted the meeting with two directors when the phone rang. "A child," he repeated, incredulous. "Let them in. I need a distraction today." The directors chuckled quietly. Theo entered, walking with short but firm steps. Richard watched him with an ironic smile, like someone watching an impromptu play. "So, boy," said the tycoon, resting his arms on the table. "Lost. Want to visit a relative." Theo took a deep breath, placed the folder on the table, and calmly unzipped it. He took out the envelope again. "My name is Theodore Mercer," he declared. "I am the legal heir to this company." The directors immediately burst into laughter. Richard let out a loud, almost theatrical laugh. "Heir," he said, wiping a tear of amusement from the corner of his eye. "Where did you come from, kid? A comedy movie?" Theo didn't react. He wasn't intimidated. He simply slid the envelope toward Richard, who stopped laughing when he noticed the official seal. The CEO opened the envelope and took out the document. His eyes scanned the first few lines, and for the first time in weeks, his expression changed, not to anger nor disbelief, but pure discomfort. The will bore Edward Mercer's signature. The founder's last wish was clear: "I name as my sole legitimate heir my son Theodore Mercer, born on..." The date was there. The certificate was attached as well, and the mother's name. Richard swallowed hard. Theo observed each reaction, but said nothing. His mother's past, always kept silent, now revealed a truth that would change everything, and he knew that Richard was the biggest obstacle in his path. The CEO slammed the document shut. "And where has this heir been all this time?" she asked, trying to regain control. "Living with my mother," Theo replied simply. "Edward knew about me, and he got everything ready before he died." The atmosphere became heavy, dense. Richard stood up slowly. He was a man accustomed to dominating rooms, commanding respect, controlling narratives. But now, facing a 10-year-old child, he felt the structure he had built around himself begin to crumble, but he would not be defeated so easily. "Very well, Theodore," he said, forcing a smile. "I'll check everything with the company's lawyers. But don't think it will be that simple." Theo had expected this reaction. He knew that a silent war was beginning, against influential executives, against his father's own legacy, and against the man who had laughed at his existence. The battle had just begun, and he was ready. News of the appearance of an alleged underage heir spread through Mercer Industries like wildfire. Within minutes, executives who barely raised their heads to greet colleagues were gathered in small circles, whispering, analyzing theories, and trying to figure out how a child had bypassed security and reached the top of the most heavily fortified company on the East Coast. Meanwhile, in a meeting room isolated from the rest of the floor, Richard Caldwell stared, still stunned, at the envelope left by Theo. He had sent the boy temporarily to an anteroom under the pretext of carrying out necessary checks, but it was merely a way to buy time. He feared that the document was all too real. Mercer Industries was a colossus with deep roots in the history of the United States, a conglomerate that began with small infrastructure projects in rural Texas and, under the leadership of Edward Mercer, had transformed into an empire that financed bridges, smart cities, and innovative urban technology projects. Everyone knew his meteoric trajectory, an orphan with a grand vision, determined, tenacious. A man who had built his empire alone, or at least that's what everyone believed until that moment. The only figure who seemed to maintain composure was Helen Brooks, the company's finance director. With her thin-rimmed glasses and meticulous posture, Helen carried a reputation for being one of the sharpest minds on Wall Street. She was also one of the few people Edward truly respected. Upon hearing the child's story and seeing the official stamp on the envelope, her face remained impassive. "That changes things," she said, examining Richard with a clinical eye, "and it changes things quickly." Richard massaged his temples. "We will not act before confirming the authenticity. Children can be manipulated. Wills can be forged." "Not that one," Helen replied, turning to the window. "I recognize that signature. I worked with Edward long enough to recognize every stroke of it." Richard frowned. He didn't like it when someone disagreed with his improbable plans, much less when it was Helen, but he couldn't deny that she was right. The signature seemed legitimate, the stamp too, and the attached birth certificate had everything it needed to have. Everything fit together too perfectly to be a coincidence. On the other side of the room, Theo sat in a chair far too large for him, observing the modern architecture of the place. He was extremely observant. His eyes scanned the room as if absorbing every detail. The minimalist paintings on the wall, the digital meeting screen, the polarized glass that partially obscured the executives passing by in the hallway. He understood more about it than someone his age should. "My father lived here," she thought, "and nobody knew I existed." The door opened, and a woman with grey hair and a gentle expression entered. She was Margaret Collins, Edward's personal assistant for over 20 years. Theo recognized her immediately. His mother had spoken of her once, fondly. "Theodore?" she asked softly. "I knew your father. He didn't talk much about his personal life, but I remember seeing a picture of you in his wallet. Your presence here doesn't surprise me as much as it should." The sincerity of that sentence comforted Theo in a way he hadn't expected. Back in the room, Richard tried to piece things back together. He wasn't just fighting a boy, he was fighting the ghost of Edward Mercer, against decisions made in secret, against secrets from which he had been excluded, despite his professed loyalty. "Helen, we need to buy some time," Richard finally stated. "In the meantime, find out everything about this boy. School, mother, background. If there's any flaw in this story, I need to know." Helen stared at him for a long time. "Richard, you shouldn't underestimate this boy. He's Edward's son, and if he's inherited even half of his father's shrewdness, he'll be a much tougher opponent than he seems." Richard looked away. He didn't want to admit it, but that's exactly how he felt. In another wing, Theo watched the city from above, while Margaret offered him water. Despite the fear he tried to hide, he knew he wasn't there by chance. His mother had spent years protecting that truth, waiting for the right moment, and that moment had arrived. He didn't want to destroy the company. He wanted to understand it, and more importantly, he wanted to understand who his father had really been. But Richard Caldwell had no intention of letting a 10-year-old boy change his life, and so the pieces were placed on the board. The game was only just beginning. The meeting room high up in the building had become a center of tension, even with its glass walls and impeccable decor. The atmosphere seemed smaller, tighter, as if Theo's presence had compressed the air inside. Richard Caldwell, used to being in charge, realized that now he was the one reacting, and that irritated him deeply. Late in the afternoon, he called an emergency meeting with the legal department and some key directors. The Oval Room was filled with important figures from the company, including Helen Brooks, always punctual, and the chief counsel, Dr. William Harding, a thin man with an austere gaze, famous for finding legal loopholes even in seemingly unquestionable documents. "Here's the will," Richard said, placing the envelope on the table as a challenge. "I need you to confirm its authenticity. Finding inconsistencies will be useful." Harding examined each page with clinical care. The signature, the stamps, the legal language, everything seemed too solid to be the work of a quick forgery. He adjusted his glasses, scratching his chin. "It's going to be hard to argue with that," he murmured. "Edwards was meticulous, and this has his style in every paragraph." Richard clenched his jaw in displeasure. He would have preferred to hear that it was all a well-orchestrated scam. However, the lawyer continued, "But not impossible." He held up the document. "We need to track down the exact date, the witnesses, the registry office. There's always a detail that can be disputed. If the record is incomplete, or if there are signs of manipulation, we can discredit part of the process." Richard took a deep breath. That was the closest thing to relief he would have had that day. Meanwhile, Theo remained in the building under Margaret's supervision. She tried to keep him comfortable, but it was difficult to hide the hostile atmosphere around him. Several employees watched the boy as if he were watching a comet fall into their backyard, fascinated but apprehensive. He didn't talk much. He simply analyzed everything around him with a posture that was too mature for his age. Margaret, who had known Edward since the company's inception, saw familiar traits in him: his focused gaze, his silent way of observing his surroundings, his rigid determination. She imagined that seeing that in someone so young would be comforting, but in truth it provoked unease. Every child with that level of focus and seriousness carried something very heavy inside. During the following hours, Richard began to act aggressively behind the scenes. He ordered the public relations team to quell any rumors about the alleged heir. He had contracts reviewed, activated contacts in the immigration department and even the Internal Revenue Service, trying to uncover anything that could destabilize the boy and his mother. It was a typical move for someone who had survived decades in the corporate world, to find a shadow, a crack, a mistake, and amplify it until it destroyed the other side. But there was something Richard didn't know. Theo was not alone. As he stepped out of the anteroom to get a drink of water, he overheard two employees talking about the investigations the CEO had ordered. He stood motionless behind the partition, absorbing every word. His face grew more serious than before. That company seemed more like a battlefield than a legacy. When he returned to Margaret's side, he gripped the black briefcase more tightly, as if his life were inside it. In a way, it was. Later that day, Helen appeared in the anteroom and called the boy aside to talk, in a corner protected from the constant flow of people. "Theodore," she said, crouching down to be at the boy's level, "do you understand what you're getting yourself into?" Theo nodded, though his expression showed that his understanding stemmed more from necessity than from experience. "I'm doing what my father asked," he replied. Helen observed his eyes for a few seconds. There was no arrogance, no naivete, just a surprisingly mature determination. "You need to know," she continued, "that Richard isn't going to make things easy. He believes the company should be his, and he's going to fight for it." "I'll fight too," Theo said, almost in a whisper, but firmly. Helen straightened her posture, crossing her arms. For the first time, she considered the possibility that this boy might be more like Edward than anyone else there. Meanwhile, Richard adopted more direct tactics. He asked the legal department to schedule an emergency hearing to try to legally block Theo's entry as an heir until everything was verified. It was a classic move: delay as much as possible, gain time to build narratives, wear down the opponent. But there was someone who began to silently question Richard's motives: Margaret. She knew Edward intimately. She knew that if he had left behind a son, there was a reason for keeping the secret for so many years, probably a reason to protect the boy. And she also knew that Edward had been suspicious of Richard in recent years. The atmosphere between them had changed, though no one mentioned it aloud. By the end of the day, the tension had reached a critical point. Richard went down to the reception to leave and found Theo in the same hall, holding his briefcase, ready to leave with Margaret. Their glances were silent, heavy. There was no respect, only a mutual assessment, like two rivals who had just recognized their opponent. Richard leaned slightly forward. "This isn't over," he murmured. "I know," Theo replied just as calmly. It was the beginning of a conflict that would define not only the succession of the company, but the future of everyone there. In the days that followed, Mercer Industries became a battleground of silent disputes. Although most employees didn't have access to the internal discussions, the atmosphere was palpable. And as in any large company, rumors spread faster than official memos. While Richard Caldwell struggled to maintain control, new elements emerged, expanding the main conflict in ways he could not have foreseen. Theo's appearance at the company headquarters attracted more attention than expected. A blurry photo of him entering the building went viral on corporate forums, sparking the curiosity of specialized reporters. And this brought to light an uncomfortable question: who was his mother? Richard ordered a thorough investigation, but each search raised more questions than answers. The mother's employment history, Amelia Carter, the medical records, the sudden move to a remote neighborhood. Everything seemed too ordinary to the point of seeming carefully constructed. When Helen received part of the reports, she frowned. She knew that someone as organized as Edward wouldn't leave loose ends. If her story seemed too clean, it was probably because he had protected her or instructed her to change everything before he died. This subplot became a source of pressure for Theo, though he didn't realize it. Richard tried to find any flaw to discredit the motherhood, the birth certificate, even the boy's presence in his father's life. But the documents were too solid. And silently, Helen began to wonder, what did Edward know about Richard? Why hide a child from him and from the company? The Mercer Industries Board of Directors, comprised of 6 veteran members, became a minefield. Some members, mainly the older ones, felt sympathy for the boy. They remembered how Edward had fought to build the company and respected his final decision, regardless of how shocking it was. Others, more aligned with Richard, saw Theo as a threat to the company's future and to their own bonuses and positions. The silent clash between them intensified. Meetings became tense. Alliances began to shift. And without Richard realizing it, Helen began to discreetly sound out the neutral members, trying to understand who would yield if a vote were needed. This internal division began to shape the future without anyone, except Helen, realizing it. Margaret Collins, Edward's personal assistant, became a central figure. She knew details that no one else knew, intimate conversations, the founder's mood swings, decisions that preceded his death, and most importantly, she knew that Edward had distanced himself from Richard in his final years. One night, unable to keep quiet, Margaret went to the house where Theo and his mother were temporarily staying, a discreet apartment paid for by Edward himself months before he died. She sat down at the table with Amelia, who greeted her with worried eyes. "Did he know this would happen?" asked the assistant, looking at Theo, who was quietly playing with an architecture book. Amelia took a deep breath. "He knew he needed to protect our son," she replied, "but he didn't expect to die so soon." Margaret looked at the boy again and felt an unexpected sense of responsibility. You couldn't change the past, but perhaps you could help protect his future. And so his silent decision was born. She would become the bridge between Theo and Edward's legacy. The news of a possible underage heir inevitably attracted the attention of the supervisory board and external investors, and this generated a critical consequence. An extraordinary general meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later with the aim of clarifying the succession situation. This event put everyone under pressure. Richard would have little time to discredit the will. Helen would have little time to analyze all of Edward's hidden documents. Theo would have little time to prepare to face a room full of powerful adults, many of whom were determined to take him down. And Margaret would have little time to find out what Edward really knew and why he had chosen to keep their son a secret. The tension increased with each passing day, accelerating the pace of the narrative and inevitably intertwining the subplots. Each subplot began to push the main conflict to a boiling point. The investigation into Amelia brought Richard's obsession to light. The division within the board of directors threatened the company's stability. Margaret's quiet loyalty provided a counterpoint to Richard's power. The extraordinary assembly brought everyone closer to a revelation that would change everything. The behind-the-scenes war was escalating. And at the center, a 10-year-old boy was becoming, without even realizing it, the most important piece on that chessboard. The extraordinary general meeting loomed like an inescapable shadow, consuming every minute of Mercer Industries' routine. The entire building seemed to vibrate with tension. It was as if the glass walls, once symbols of transparency and modernity, now reflected only uncertainty and silent disputes. Richard Caldwell knew that this event could define his future. Therefore, he intensified his strategy. He pressured departments, intimidated employees, and hired specialists to analyze every detail of the will. He was convinced that if he found even one inconsistency, he could have everything annulled in court and retain power. But one grey morning, something unexpected happened, the kind of event Edward Mercer could never have planned, but one that would completely alter the course of history. Helen Brooks was in the confidential files room, a rarely visited space where decades-old documents were stored in standardized drawers. She was reviewing old records, searching for any information that would help her understand why Edward had kept Theo and Amelia shielded from the corporate circle. As he browsed through labeled boxes, something caught his eye. A folder with no formal identification. Just a handwritten alphanumeric code, something no executive would use. She opened it. Inside, he found incomplete financial reports, terminated contracts, and a series of printed emails that, at first glance, seemed disorganized. But as he flipped through the pages, his expression changed. There was evidence of internal irregularities, signed off by departments directly under Richard's responsibility, that occurred during the last 3 years of Edward's life. Small sums of money, seemingly harmless transfers, but which added up to millions. Edward knew. And he was investigating Richard before he died. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. This was the kind of revelation that could be a game changer, and also the kind of truth that could destroy careers, reputations, and perhaps the company itself. But that wasn't the most impactful point yet. At the bottom of the folder, there was a note, handwritten by Edward, recognizable by its firm handwriting. "If something happens to me, Theo needs to be protected. There are people who will do anything to take what doesn't belong to them." Helen closed her eyes for a moment. Everything made sense now. Theo wasn't there by chance. Edward had foreseen an attempted power grab, and he had left clues, hidden but not inaccessible. The folder in Helen's hands changed everything. That same day, as Helen was heading to the elevator to pick up Margaret and discuss what she had found, a strange incident occurred in the underground parking garage. Richard, who was getting out of his car, caught a glimpse of a black vehicle speeding around a bend, nearly hitting Helen. She managed to throw herself to the side at the last second, landing on her knees on the concrete. The car didn't stop. It didn't slow down. It didn't hesitate. The security camera captured only a blurry license plate and a driver hidden in the darkness. Helen stood up, breathing heavily, but without serious injuries. And as she brushed the dust off her clothes, a sinister thought crossed her mind. That was no accident. Richard watched the scene from a distance. He didn't comment, but his gaze didn't express shock. It showed something colder, calculation. Helen, now more convinced than ever, realized that the folder needed to reach the right hands immediately, and those hands belonged to only two people. Margaret or Theo. Later that night, Helen showed up at the apartment where Theo and his mother were staying, her face pale and a file pressed against her chest. Amelia greeted her, worried. Margaret followed right behind, her gaze heavy with emotion. Helen opened the folder on the table. "Edward was investigating Richard," he revealed. "These documents are proof that he suspected something serious, and he knew that Theo would be in danger if the truth came out." Margaret put her hand to her mouth, shocked. Theo, sitting at the table with his legs dangling in the air, listened intently to every word. He understood more than he let on. This changes everything," Amelia said, her voice faltering. Helen nodded in agreement. "Yes, and that means that at the assembly, Richard will not only try to overturn the will, but he may also try to destroy anyone who poses a threat to the supposed legacy he believes is his." Margaret looked at Theo. "He's going to try to humiliate you publicly," she said, her voice trembling. Helen added, or worse. The silence in the room was suffocating. The turning point was right there before them, printed on yellowed papers. Theo, although a child, processed that information in a surprising way. He didn't understand the legal mechanisms, but he understood something much simpler and more profound. His father had trusted him, and now he needed to protect him, even if posthumously. He raised his head, looking at the three women in front of him. "I'm going to the assembly," he said with conviction. "I'm going to show what he left behind, everything." Amelia opened her mouth to protest, but Margaret interrupted her with a gentle gesture. "He's right," I said, "and he's not alone." Helen placed the folder in Margaret's hands. "Get ready. When Richard finds out these documents exist, he'll do anything to stop them." And so, the turning point was solidified. The story had taken a completely different turn, and this time there was no turning back. The discovery of the hidden documents by Helen triggered a chain reaction inside and outside Mercer Industries. Even keeping the revelation secret between Helen, Margaret, Amelia, and Theo, the consequences began to spread inevitably, especially since Richard Caldwell, perceptive and suspicious by nature, sensed that something had changed in Helen's behavior after the parking lot incident. In the following days, Richard intensified his paranoid routine. He had new cameras installed in the hallways, reinforced private security, and began discreetly monitoring the devices of key employees. All illegal, but nothing unusual in his desperate quest to maintain power. He noticed that Helen was more reserved, conversing from a distance away from the cameras, avoiding direct discussions with him. This irritated him deeply, and irritation for Richard was synonymous with impulsiveness. During a meeting with the legal department, he lost control for the first time in weeks. "I want everything," he roared, slamming his hand on the table. "Every file, every old report, every archived email. Edward left something behind, and we're going to find it, no matter what it costs." Harding, the lawyer, watched him cautiously. He was beginning to wonder if he was betting on the right side of the fight. Meanwhile, Helen adopted a calculated stance. She knew that any slip-up would put Theo and Amelia at risk. Therefore, she began to act subtly. Small conversations with neutral directors, reorganizing agendas for the assembly, and most importantly, silent financial moves to safeguard funds that Richard might try to embezzle. She also began to assemble a more complete dossier based on Edward's documents, transforming the seemingly chaotic file into a clear narrative of corruption and abuse of power within the company. Each discovery made it clear that Richard had overstepped the mark long ago, and that Edward, before he died, had gathered enough evidence to bring down the interim CEO. In the apartment, Amelia tried to keep Theo on a normal schedule, despite the whirlwind surrounding them. She took him to school, prepared simple meals, and tried to keep the television off to avoid speculation that leaked to the specialized media. But the tension was palpable. Theo, sitting on the sofa with focused eyes, spent hours reviewing the black folder, memorizing details he considered important. He didn't fully understand the technical content, but he understood the essential point. His father had been betrayed, and that awakened in him an almost instinctive sense of justice. Margaret went to the apartment daily, helping Amelia prepare Theo emotionally for what was to come at the assembly. Each day the boy seemed to gain more confidence, but at the same time he became quieter. It was as if the weight of responsibility was shaping him ahead of time. Despite efforts to maintain secrecy, vague information began circulating among some employees. Helen had found something strange in the company's old files. And in a corporation of that size, such a rumor spread like wildfire. When the news reached Richard's ears, he stood motionless for a few seconds. Then his expression changed, and his reaction was immediate. He called an emergency meeting with his personal security team. "I want you to find out what she thought," she said, her voice too low for her emotional state. "And I want it done today." From then on, Helen was discreetly followed, something she noticed on the very first day. But instead of hiding, he adopted an unexpected strategy. He began to act naturally, as if nothing had happened. It was a dangerous game, but one that confused Richard, and that gave him time. The assembly was approaching, and Theo felt the pressure like a knot in his stomach. He practiced how to present himself, how to hold the documents, how to breathe in the face of hard, skeptical stares. During moments of rest, he would look at a photo of his father, an image Amelia had kept since before her pregnancy. Edward smiled in the photo, young and carefree. It was strange for Theo to imagine that man enveloped in a world as dark as the one he was now facing. But each time he looked at the image, he felt more convinced. "I'm going to do what he wanted," he repeated to himself. Margaret and Helen were beginning to see in him not only a legitimate heir, but someone capable of carrying the moral strength that Edward had always possessed. The night before the meeting, Richard received an urgent notification. Edward's personal lawyer, who had been missing since the announcement of the will, had confirmed his attendance at the event. That changed everything. If the lawyer were to show up with new documents, testimonies, or records, Richard could lose not only his job, but his entire career. And at that moment, he did something no one could have predicted. He made a decision that would put everyone in danger. The assembly would not be just a legal battle. It would be a clash of forces, and it was about to explode. The morning of the extraordinary general meeting dawned with a heavy, overcast sky, as if even the weather sensed the impact of what was about to happen. The main building of Mercer Industries, normally an imposing symbol of stability, seemed to breathe tension. Vehicles arrived one after another, bringing directors, shareholders, legal advisors and journalists, positioned at a distance, awaiting any sign of unrest. Inside the main room, a huge oval table dominated the space. Monitors on the walls displayed performance charts and financial reports, but no one paid attention to that day. The focus was on something else, the clash between Richard Caldwell and the child who would change the history of the company. Theo arrived accompanied by his mother, Amelia, and Margaret. Helen was waiting for them at the side entrance to avoid the main hallway. The boy seemed even smaller in that dark blue suit, but there was something in his eyes that belied his stature. Determination. Helen approached, crouching down to be at his level. "Remember, you're not here to fight. You're here to tell the truth," he said softly. Theo nodded. Upon entering the room, conversations ceased. Some glances immediately turned condescending, others curious. Richard, positioned at the head of the table, raised his face and smiled. Not a friendly smile, but a smile of contempt. "I see they brought the morning star," he remarked, crossing his arms. "I hope he's ready to understand how the real world works." Theo didn't answer. He walked to his reserved seat, guided by Margaret. The black folder, Edward's file, were on his arms as if it weighed tons. A few minutes later, the doors opened again. Edward's personal lawyer, Jonathan Reyes, entered with firm steps. He had been out of the country for weeks, supposedly settling Edward's own legal matters prior to his death. Now he emerged with an impeccable leather briefcase and a serious expression. Richard turned pale. "Gentlemen," Reyes said, "thank you for waiting. Today we will discuss not only the will, but what motivated Edward Mercer to write his last wishes in the way he did." Murmurs echoed through the room. Helen began the meeting by reading the protocol. Then she gave the floor to Richard. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and began a calculated speech. "Colleagues, we all know that Mercer needs stability, and we cannot allow irrational decisions to jeopardize our future. The will presented, which names a child as heir, is, at the very least, questionable, and today I intend to prove its invalidity." "Before any allegations are made," Reyes interrupted calmly, "I believe those present deserve to understand the full facts." Richard clenched his teeth but sat back down. Reyes opened the folder and began to reveal documents that Edward had prepared before he died. Edward feared an internal power grab, he explained. He was investigating irregular financial transactions, pressure on sensitive departments, and attempts to manipulate boards. He asked me to keep these documents until he could make them public, something he didn't have time to do. Helen then stood up and placed the black folder, the one she had found, on the center table. "This is a continuation of Mr. Reyes's documents." Edward was already building a full case. The room erupted in whispers. Richard raised his voice. "This is absurd. It's a hoax orchestrated by you to favor a boy. There's no concrete proof of—" Theo stood up for the first time. He placed his little hand on the table, and he spoke. "My father left me this because he knew someone here wanted to take what was his. He didn't write my name because I'm a child. He wrote my name because I'm his son." Absolute silence. The boy's emotional security surprised even Amelia, who put her hand to her chest, absorbing the impact of the scene. Realizing he was losing control of the situation, Richard stood up so abruptly that the chair tipped over. "Enough!" he shouted. "You think you're going to destroy decades of work because this brat memorized half a dozen phrases that someone put in his mouth?" Helen approached Theo discreetly. Reyes stared coldly at Richard. A child doesn't fabricate financial reports. A child doesn't forge bank signatures. A child doesn't create clandestine investment accounts. All of this is documented, and it all comes from departments under your supervision, Caldwell. The impact was immediate. Several directors exchanged alarmed glances. Some physically distanced themselves from Richard. "You can't prove anything," he shouted. "I can," said Helen, "and we'll present it to the federal auditors after this meeting." That's when Richard realized it wasn't just his job that was at risk, it was his freedom, and desperate people do desperate things. In a swift movement, Richard stepped forward to try and snatch the documents from Theo's hands. But before he could touch them, two company security guards, who until then had been under his command, stepped in front of him. Richard froze. The security guards looked at Margaret, and she simply said, "Protect the heir." Richard stepped back, breathing unevenly, his gaze wild. After minutes of controlled chaos, Reyes called for a formal vote by the chair. The question was simple. Should Edward Mercer's will be accepted in its entirety, or should its annulment be requested? One by one, the directors raised their hands. The overwhelming majority approved the will. Richard watched, defeated, the face red with silent fury. When the result was confirmed, Theo gripped the folder tightly. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. It was as if he knew that this was not a victory. It was merely the end of the battle, or perhaps the beginning of another. The Mercer Industries building seemed quieter than ever in the days following the meeting. It wasn't the calm silence of routine, but a dense, tense silence, typical of a company that had just gone through an internal earthquake. The decision in favor of Theo had been officially communicated to shareholders the following day, and within hours, headlines were appearing throughout the financial media. Miner inherits billion-dollar fortune. Mercer's future remains uncertain. Financial scandal. Richard Caldwell under investigation. But inside the company, the feeling was not one of relief. It was a time of anticipation. Something big was yet to come. Margaret called an emergency meeting with the reduced council. Only those members who had shown loyalty to Edward's will. Theo did not attend. Amelia thought it best to keep him at home that day, but Helen was present, as was Reyes, who had now officially assumed the role of executor of the will. Dozens of documents were scattered across the table, reports, contracts, organizational charts, preliminary audits. "We need to stabilize the company," Margaret said, her voice firm with the knowing she was about to shoulder the weight of a giant. "Before the shareholders flee, or Caldwell attempts some kind of legal retaliation," Helen added, "and to protect Theo. He's at the center of all this, and any maneuver against the inheritance will necessarily go through him," Reyes agreed. "I've already started the process of blocking access to the financial accounts under Caldwell's responsibility, but that's going to irritate him even more." No one disagreed. Richard hadn't appeared since the assembly, but that didn't mean he was defeated. On the contrary, that afternoon, while the board worked to strengthen the company's structure, Richard appeared at an impromptu press conference in Manhattan's financial district. "This is all a setup," he declared to the cameras. "Edward was under the influence of people who wanted to remove him from power, and now they want to use a child as a puppet. I will not allow the company I helped build to be destroyed." He presented himself as a victim, like a wronged hero. And worse, part of the audience believed it. Social media erupted in debate. Some defended Theo. Others called the whole situation an internal coup. Major investors began pressuring Margaret for an official response. Mercer was entering the eye of a storm. On Friday night, Amelia was putting Theo to bed when she noticed something strange. Two unfamiliar cars parked on the street, with their engines off and no lights. One of them had passed by earlier. The other had appeared after sunset. She closed the curtains slowly, without waking Theo, and immediately called Helen. "It could just be a coincidence, Amelia," Helen said, though her tone was worried. "But we can't take any risks. I'm sending 2 people to stand guard at your door, and tomorrow I'll take Theo to a safer place." Amelia ran her fingers nervously through her hair. "He's involved in something much bigger than he should be." "I know, but we're not going to let anything happen to him." On Saturday morning, Helen and Reyes were reviewing the latest files when they found something unexpected, an internal email sent months earlier in which Edward explicitly stated his intention to speak with federal authorities. It was the missing piece. This changes everything," Reyes said, running a hand over his face, perplexed. "If Caldwell finds out we have this, he'll go crazy." "He's already gone mad," Helen replied. "The difference is that now we have ammunition he can't dispute." They decided to keep that document for the right moment, the moment of final impact. On Sunday afternoon, while Theo was resting in a safe cabin away from the city, Amelia received a call from an unknown number. "Mrs. Brooks?" The male voice on the other end sounded rehearsed, cold. "We have urgent information regarding your son's case. We need you to come immediately to the address we will send you." She froze. Who is speaking? Someone who wants to help them. The call dropped. Amelia took a deep breath, trembling, and she did what any mother would do. She warned Helen. When Helen answered, her voice was decisive, without hesitation. "Don't leave where you are. This is a trap." On Monday, before the workday began, the board of directors was already meeting in a private room on the 33rd floor. Everyone knew that this would be the beginning of the end. Richard had filed a legal challenge against the vote. The media was in a frenzy. Investors were putting pressure on him. Mercer's future was about to crumble or be reborn. Margaret looked at Helen and Reyes. "Everything will be decided today," she said. Helen took a deep breath. "We're ready." But Caldwell is too, and as the city dawned outside, its skyscrapers dotting the horizon, everyone present understood. The final showdown was about to begin. The morning began with an icy wind cutting through the main entrance of Mercer Industries. The entire building seemed suspended, as if holding its breath, awaiting impact. Journalists lined the sidewalks, drones discreetly hovered above the building, and vans from television stations jostled for space on the street. It was clear that everyone knew something big was going to happen that day. Theo had arrived very early, accompanied by Amelia, Helen, and 2 private security agents. He walked silently, holding the same black briefcase he had previously barely been able to lift. Now, even though it was still small in his hands, it seemed like an extension of his courage. The emergency meeting had been called. The agenda was straightforward: to review Richard Caldwell's appeal and his attempt to invalidate the will. But everyone sensed that this meeting would be much more than that. The Oval Room was packed. Directors, lawyers, auditors, and representatives of major investors occupied their seats. Margaret presided over the table, with Helen and Reyes beside her, while Amelia sat behind Theo, a firm hand on his shoulder. The doors suddenly opened. Richard went inside, not like the elegant and calculated executive he once was, but like someone on the verge of collapse. Disheveled suit, deep dark circles under his eyes, feverish gaze. Behind him, 2 private lawyers carried bulky briefcases. He stepped up to the table and slammed his hand on it forcefully. "This charade ends today." No one answered. Margaret simply said, "Let's begin." Richard opened his briefcase and spread the documents across the center of the table. "Here," she declared, her voice trembling but loud, "is proof that Edward was mentally compromised in the months leading up to this absurd will. He was paranoid, easily influenced, vulnerable. He was manipulated. You were manipulated." He turned to Theo with disdain. "And all this just to put a child in charge of a multi-billion-dollar company." Some of those present murmured uncomfortably. It was the strongest attack Richard could make. questioning Edward's sanity. Helen leaned forward. "Are you implying that Edward Mercer, CEO for over 2 decades, was incapable of managing his own life?" "I'm stating this," Richard retorted, "and I have witnesses ready to testify." Reyes crossed his arms, watching intently. When Richard finished his presentation, Margaret gave the floor to Reyes. He stood up slowly, walked to the center of the room, and placed a single envelope on the table. "These are documents written and signed by Edward Mercer in full mental capacity," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But the content is not only proof of his lucidity, it's also proof that he knew exactly what he was up against, and who he needed to protect this company from." Their eyes met. The tension grew. Helen opened the envelope, and he retrieved the document found in the internal system, the email Edward had written weeks before he died, warning that he would seek federal authorities to reveal serious irregularities, all of them linked to Richard's department. A devastating silence filled the room. It wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that destroys reputations. Richard's eyes widened. He looked like he'd been punched. "No! This is fake!" he shouted, taking a few steps forward. "You fabricated this. You fabricated it. Edward would never send something like this." But before he could continue shouting, one of the expert auditors in the room raised his voice. "I analyzed the digital signature. The record on the server is authentic." Another auditor added, "And the deletion attempt notification as well." Edward tried to delete it, but the message got stuck in automatic backup. Richard's legs gave way for a moment. He leaned on the table, breathing unsteadily. The truth had struck him forcefully. Suddenly, he pulled out his cell phone and began typing something frantically. Messages, perhaps instructions for someone outside. Helen realized. "Take that phone away from him," she ordered. But Richard was faster. He ran to the door. 2 security guards blocked the way. "Get out of the way," he shouted. "I know my rights." One of the security guards replied calmly, "And we know about their crimes." Richard recoiled, his eyes wide, trapped. That's when Theo stood up. Nobody asked for it. Nobody expected it. He walked to the center of the room with small but firm steps. She looked at Richard with the raw sincerity that only a child could have. "My father wasn't afraid of you," he said, "but you were afraid of my father." The impact of the phrase reverberated like a blow. Richard was trembling. He seemed smaller, powerless, defeated. Theo continued. "He told me that when someone tries to hide the truth, it's because it's the only thing that can hurt them. You wanted the company because you had nothing else." Margaret watched in silence. Amelia discreetly wiped away a tear. Reyes simply nodded proudly. Richard, however, did not answer. He simply sank into his chair, crumbling inside. Margaret regained control. "Shareholders present, we will now vote to uphold Edward Mercer's will, to recognize Theo as the rightful heir, and to recommend a formal investigation against Richard Caldwell." Voting has begun. Arms went up, one after the other, almost all of them. Helen announced, "The decision is unanimous." Richard lowered his head. Theo squeezed his mother's hand. The company had chosen its future, and the future was only 8 years old. The hallways of Mercer Industries had never been quieter than the morning after the vote. The climax that had shaken the boardroom was now spreading throughout the entire building like an unbelievable rumor. A child had defeated one of the most influential men in the corporate world. Richard Caldwell was escorted out of the building by federal agents a few hours after the assembly ended. Formal charges, fraud, financial manipulation, obstruction of justice, and misappropriation of funds were underway. His name quickly disappeared from doors, files, business cards, and even the memories of the most pragmatic. Meanwhile, Theo, sitting in a smaller meeting room, awaited the arrival of Margaret, Helen, Reyes, and Amelia. The boy seemed exhausted. Not physically, but emotionally. like someone who, even without understanding all the complexities, perceived the gravity of what had happened. Amelia approached and knelt beside him. "It's over, my love," she whispered. "You're safe now." Theo looked up. Would Dad be happy? The question caused everyone in the room to stop moving. Helen answered first, gently. "He would be proud. Very proud. You had the courage that many adults didn't have." Reyes concluded, "And you protected what was his, and what will be yours." Margaret, who normally maintained a more serious demeanor, approached and placed a light hand on Theo's shoulder. "But don't worry. You won't carry this weight alone. We'll guide you step by step." Theo nodded, resting his chin on his small hands. In the following days, Mercer began a complex restructuring process. External audits were launched to verify all the damage caused by Richard. Illegal contracts were invalidated. Corrupt departments underwent deep cuts. Margaret assumed interim leadership with almost surgical skill. Helen became interim vice president, responsible for overseeing critical sectors. Reyes was appointed as Theo's permanent legal representative until he comes of age. And the boy? He began visiting the company only once a week to understand, in a light and gradual way, what it meant to be the heir to an empire. He observed everything with silent curiosity, and at times he seemed more mature than many others inside. One afternoon before they left, Theo asked to visit the empty office that had belonged to his father. The room had been sealed off during the investigation and had only been reopened that day. As they entered, the familiar scent of polished wood and antique leather filled the air. Theo walked over to the table. He placed the palm of his hand on top of her, and he closed his eyes. "I'll take care of it, Dad," she said softly. "I promise." Amelia hugged him from behind, squeezing him tightly. None of the adults interrupted the moment. It was the end of an era and the inevitable beginning of another. 3 years later, Mercer Industries had become stronger than ever. Under Margaret and Helen's leadership, and with Theo quietly growing up and learning the ways of the empire he would inherit, the company regained its reputation and moved forward with projects that Edward had left outlined. In a discreet ceremony, Theo received a small gold brooch bearing the Mercer symbol, a gift originally intended for Edward. He smiled, not out of pride, but because he understood that he carried something greater, a legacy that had survived chaos, ambition, and lies. If this story touched you in any way, whether through Theo's courage, Amelia's strength, or the silent fight against corruption, share your thoughts. Each reading brings a new perspective, a different reflection. Comment on what surprised you the most, which character made the biggest impact on your journey, or which moment is etched in your memory. Stories come alive when they are discussed, analyzed, and shared.